Morning, everyone. This is the fourth workshop. This one will be a little bit less technical, and it will talk more about the different ethical concepts within AI. So there's a huge list of the different problems, and I thought I would just cover each of them, at least these ones on this slide, kind of briefly, so that you can be a little bit more aware about the different ethical issues that AI has, and just help you understand um, some of the things that are actual problems with AI and some of those that are just things that we see in the news and isn't really aren't actually substantiated issues that we should be fearing. So to begin with, we know that AI has completely taken, the world by storm. It's changed a lot of the way that we talk about things. It's changed the way that a lot of people think about their jobs. Those that are already working and those that are trying to get jobs. It's changed the way that people have done interview processes and a lot more. And of course, it's become a regular like household term. Normal people now who are not studying computer science or who are not who aren't programmers, they understand what AI is at least, and they could think about some AI tools. But I want you to think about, and maybe you could put in the chat, one ethical dilemma that you've heard about in tech recently. Feel free to unmute your microphone if you don't mind recording, or you can just put it in the chat. Okay, maybe we don't know many ethical dilemmas. We'll move on. So one of the problems that has come around due to AI becoming more powerful and being able to do more tasks is this fear of job displacement. So if you, let's say, were getting a cup of coffee that you thought was, really nice, something that, tasted really good, but it was expensive, but you were fine with paying the extra amount because you like the extra quality. Imagine there was a competitor who was able to have, cheaper baristas and cheaper machines with cheaper coffee beans, but the quality was the same, and let's say you couldn't tell the difference. Why would you ever go for an expensive coffee when you could go for something that was cheaper? And that's the problem with AI and job displacement, because there are clearly fears, right? So if you look at certain models, right? So this is OpenAI's model, their ChatGPT, and this is DeepSeek. And both of them you can see they are extremely, extremely cheap to be able to run these models. Less than $15 an hour is the US's minimum wage. And if you're able to get this much output from a model, and this is per million tokens, so we're talking about a lot more than what a normal person would be able to get done within an hour. And you see here, right, just $2.74 an hour. This is extremely cheap to run these models. And maybe right now they're not good enough to do an entire person's work. Maybe they can just do a few of their tasks. But it's clear that if they were to get more powerful, then these fears would increase. And it's not something that is just a thing of, oh, it might not happen, because even already now there are people who are losing their jobs because other people who have been able to use these tools are able to upskill themselves, and now they're able to do much more work than their other coworkers are, and so lots of companies are no longer, hiring more people for the same rough areas of jobs because they know that, well, one person can do a lot more than they used to be able to. And there are lots of companies out there who are rescinding their offers to people and let people go very frequently, especially in the tech space where things are moving very, very fast. The second ethical issue that I want to talk about was bias and discrimination. So this is a really, really big problem when it comes to AI. You see, when we build a model to do anything, we're going through a set of steps, right? So the first one is thinking about the actual research problem. And there, of course, if you haven't defined your problem correctly, right? So maybe you're doing something that is for all kinds of users. If you've not thought about certain groups and certain people, you may have introduced bias into your problem itself, the thing that you're trying to solve. And then, of course, data collection. So then when you go out and then collect data, you might have problems. And it may not be the same kinds of biases to do with the demographics. It might just be that you've only focused on one country or one city or one street, and you haven't focused on things on a larger scale. So your actual data might be biased. Label bias, for example, because we know that with AI, we have to label our data. If you're, say, getting images of scans, medical scans labeled by certain experts, maybe one of them is able to do a much better job than the other, or is more accurate than the other. And then you can have bias just introduced directly from just getting that label. Exclusion bias is another big one. We know that there are certain groups and people that are less represented in society, and they don't engage too much with things like data collection processes and these all kinds of opportunities, and so they get left out of the data. And then when it comes to processing that data, you also have different kinds of biases, right? So you have different kinds of extreme values, these outliers. So if you imagine we took, a data set of people's house prices, we have to be careful in terms of what we want that model to do, because if we keep in all the most expensive homes, we'd be biasing the data, and the model it would be difficult for it to learn exactly, that the average house price and that what the majority of people live in is nowhere near what those extremes are. But the model won't know that unless you explicitly do something about those outliers. Confounding bias is another big problem. So this is where you look at some features or some inputs and you're trying to get some output. And so you say that our model says that, based on you having, a certain weight, you have this much risk of having obesity, let's say. But then they don't think about other things that could contribute to that. So if a person has, let's say, a certain disease or a certain illness, maybe they're more likely to develop obesity anyway. But you're focusing it on the weight itself. And so this is where it's confounding, where you're no longer considering very important variables that do also have an input impact on your output, but you're not using it. And when you're actually developing and validating your model, there are so many issues that could come out. Maybe you're not training and splitting your data sets correctly. Maybe you're letting some of your test data into your training data. And maybe just the type of model you're using will have a bias itself. And of course, the final one, when it comes to actually implementing your model, many models, will work on the training data. And when you test it, it will be fine. But the problem is most of the time, that's all on like one data set, and all you've done is split it. But it roughly comes from the same, groups of people and the same distribution, Whereas in the real world, things change, right? So time changes and people will change. And because of that, certain features might be more important than they were before. And of course, the model may then get out of date and it might not be as accurate as it used to be. So as an example, if we see a downward trend in smoking, but an upward trend in vaping, and our model doesn't capture that, and it just looks at very specific, discrete values like whether you smoke or whether you vape or not, and you're not looking, let's say, that even the history to do with, is this person maybe at high risk of potentially smoking in the future or high risk of vaping in the future, and you don't consider the way that the world can change, your model will become out of date very quickly as the world does continue to change. So now, there was a question here. So it's a scenario. So a company uses an AI tool to screen job candidates, and later it's discovered that certain groups are consistently scored lower by the tool. I've got three questions that come with the scenario. So where might bias or unfairness have come from? How could the organization address or prevent it? And who should be held accountable for the outcomes? And this is something that's been going on currently. Many companies out there will use different tools, some of them AI-based and some of them not, to, let's say, scan your CVs. And now maybe they'll ask you to submit a video, and then they'll use AI to go through that video. So they'll look at the images, they'll look at your facial expressions and how you are in the video in terms of your appearance, and then they'll also get the transcript. So they'll convert the audio into text, and they'll put it into an AI and ask it to evaluate it. And so I guess I just give you a couple minutes to think about these questions. And remember, it's mainly talking about like because certain groups are consistently scored lower by the tool. So for the first one, and again, for any of these, if anybody has any ideas, you can just put it in the chat. If there are certain groups that are consistently being scored lower by the tool, and we see that in the first question, it's asking about where might bias and unfairness have come from. Maybe those were certain groups. I see something in the chat. So training data is a possibility. Might be using data that represented the currently existing practice at that company. Yeah, so that's exactly what we're going to mention, is that those certain groups might not have been included in that training data. And so if your tool was working on, let's say, only graduates from a specific university or who that live in a specific area, if somebody's not from those areas or hasn't gone to that university, the model would just not pick them ever because none of the people that work at that company, let's say, are from there. And so they don't have any extra, reason to pick somebody who's not similar to what they've already got. And yes, you mentioned another good point, the existing practice. Just to check, is the audio okay now?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay. Gogo, maybe try either leaving or rejoining or increasing the volume. Okay, so I will go back to the question. So in terms of the training data, yes, so you may not have had those people within your training data. And so the issue here, when you get to number two, in terms of how you could address it or prevent it, is if you know that a certain person, you're collecting certain data about them, let's say their ethnicity or their religion or where they live or what kind of school they went to. If you take all of that data, you can compare it against the people that you used in your training data. And what you can do is you could say, if this person is very unique, so I've never had somebody who's applied from this kind of place, instead of using the AI tool, let's do it manually because we don't want to risk, introducing bias. Alternatively, if it's somebody that we've already seen in the training data that this person is very similar to what we've seen already, then maybe it makes more sense that we do let the AI tool evaluate them because we've already seen people similar to them, and so we know what are the specific things that we would like to see and what wouldn't we like to see. What is it that would make somebody a better candidate, let's say. The last one is really interesting. So it's talking about who should be held accountable for the outcomes. So is it the developers of the AI tool? Is it the company itself? And again, let's say it's the company who's developed this AI tool by themselves, is the blame going to, or is the accountability upon the developers, or is it upon the management? So this will be a debate, and it will depend on the different areas. So within a company that's using such a tool, chances are because they have, the resources to have developed this in the first place. I mean, I see some responses now. So it's very difficult to determine. It would be great if we can refer to a certain regulation. And someone mentions the management. So this is really interesting because so OpenAI has had a case recently where a developer who was whistleblowing, revealing secrets about how certain practices were going on at the company, was eventually found dead. And what was reported is that it was a suicide, regardless of whether it was or it wasn't. The important thing is that now people will look at that and say they would be scared of trying to make big changes, right? That would go against management. I, if they see that there's certain practices, like let's say a company uses this AI tool and they don't like, and the company likes to keep that tool, then maybe they would not want other people to try and fix it or try to solve these issues. And that would bring fear to other, future candidates. Sorry, not future candidates, to other developers, in that, what would they actually do if they saw this stuff going on? And is it fair then to give them the accountability to put it on them? Because of course, it's difficult maybe for them to result in any change. I see another message. I think the company using it, not the developer, since they're in charge of the prompts they give to try AI and should be able to also see the data seems skewed. So that's a great point. And I think one other thing there that you mentioned is that about the data seeming skewed. So that would also rely on the developers giving the management like the issues. So I think it's both. So the developers would need to be able to test it and see that these biases exist, and they need to tell the company that look, these exist, and then it's their responsibility for solving it, because of course that's their job. And the point about regulation is really good because in the EU we have more strict we only have strict AI regulation at all in the EU currently. Everywhere else, just guidances, and there's not official acts. And since this is an AI tool, maybe people would always be able to argue that, oh well, it's AI, and it's just how it works. It will make mistakes, and they'll hide behind that rather than testing it adequately. The next one I want to talk about was privacy and trust. So, DeepSeek, this app here, it's a large language model like ChatGPT, but it's open source, meaning you can download it onto your own computer and you don't have to use it directly on, say, a website or an app. But the app itself, because it is developed by China, certain people have and countries have banned the app from being used. So you see how Australia has banned it on the government devices, and it's talking about not because it's originated from China, but because of the unacceptable risk it poses to national security. And you see here, it's banned it from all government devices and systems because of the security risk. And you see here, so this is a US representative who said that, deeply disturbing evidence that they're using DeepSeek to steal the sensitive data of US citizens. Now, this is everywhere in the news. If you try to find out DeepSeek bans, and you'll see it everywhere. But the problem is, there's a big difference between when you're using an app and a website, and then when you're using something open source that you've got on your own computer. See, the difference is that if something is open source and you can download it onto your computer, it means that you're not relying on the company to actually, process your request to take your data. Everything can stay on your own device and it doesn't have to touch the internet. Now that, of course, like technically, it would never go to China or even the app makers. They would never receive that data. And so there's no risk at all of you running that on your own device. I mean, as long as the model itself is, it's just a large language model and it's not doing anything else, which it doesn't because people have investigated and seen that it just takes prompts and gives you a request directly within your own device. And if we were to talk about, this as an app or a website that it's owned by China and that they can do certain things, well, there's lots of other things that, data it will be sent there and not just there, but any company that's out there that has a social media app, all of your data is stored on their servers and they can do whatever they want with it, even your mobile phone device. And so it's the idea of now some people almost get vilified, right? So like China as an example, and that as soon as they have any kind of innovation, it becomes, it's security risk. But if it came from the West, it's not a big problem. And the point here isn't it's China versus the West. It's the problem of it's that certain companies then will be able to do whatever they want, and then other people will get limited in terms of what they're able to do. And the whole point of privacy and trust here is that there are certain things that you'll see which are clear, like there are going to be certain problems. I don't know if I included it here, but Meta, formerly known as Facebook, they stole terabytes worth of PDF files and other things to help train their models. And obviously, they won't face anything substantial at all for what they had done. But an individual could do the same thing and could be in prison for a very long time. And then this kind of goes on to the next problem, which is that these models, these neural network models, that you give it some input and it gives you these outputs, even if it seems like it makes sense, they have this black box nature in that you don't really know what it's doing or what's going on underneath it. You don't know how it processes, those inputs and what exactly it does. Why does it produce the output that it does? And people will try and understand how they work. And so there's been a shift now to try and use these reasoning models. So rather than, you just give it an input and it gives you an output based on, what it thinks is the most likely word or sentence to respond with, they're using these reasoning models. And the idea is that at least now you can see how it goes from step to step in terms of its, quote, thinking process, which is better, and it's a better change that we're seeing. But it still has a problem with the models which aren't large language models. So there are models out there where, say, you give it a scan, an image scan, or you give it a list of symptoms, and it will tell you you've got a heart attack or you've got cancer. And those models sometimes, because they just focus on accuracy, they don't care about that interpretability, right? Because AI is not just these LLMs, there's lots of other models too. And those models, lots of people just focus on the accuracy, trying to get the best model so that it works. And so now, as a patient or whoever's using that model, you might think, well, I don't really care about knowing how it works. I just want it to be accurate and diagnose me and correctly. But then the problem is then what happens when that person, takes it to a doctor and says, look, AI said that I have cancer, and the doctor gets confused because they're like, well, how would you respond to that? Especially if a person is very confident that, no, I definitely have this because AI said it. So the next one I want to talk about was over-reliance. So Microsoft released this really nice literature review where they basically talked about the different problems with relying and using these AI tools a lot and what kind of things happen as a result. And you can go back to this later. These slides are available. But like you see, when it comes to consequences of over-reliance, it looks at when you've got this poor human and AI performance. Because what happens is that if a human or the AI was to work alone, maybe they would be able to perform fine and it wouldn't be too much of an issue. But if you are over-reliant on a specific tool, when you use it to solve trivial errors that you could have done yourself, or you ask it to do stuff that's more difficult that realistically you should be doing yourself, and especially when that AI tool that you're using isn't good at what it is you're asking for, you get this issue of over-reliance where you will ask it for basically everything. And you can see here the different mitigation techniques, right? So effectively onboarding users, right? And giving users choice, giving them personalized adjustment. And this is really important stuff, being transparent with users and giving real-time feedback and effective explanations. Because if a person was just to use a tool to give it a question, it gives you an answer, you'll be amazed by what it's able to do, and you'll use it for your homework or your schoolwork, or, your coursework at university, or even your job, your work there. I've heard many stories of people who are in companies where they've said, you can't use these tools, you're not allowed to, that they'll sneak and take a picture of it. They'll take a picture of their screen, their computer screen, and they'll give it to the AI and they'll get the solution. And they'll have their phone between their legs or in the middle of their desk, and they'll just be writing and copying whatever it gave to them. It's a really, really huge problem if people continue to focus on, or people continue to use these tools and don't develop the skills that, you know, people before these AI tools were around would have developed to help do these tasks. Move on now to accessibility. So you mentioned in that last slide about training, getting effective onboarding. And so this is where accessibility comes in. Because me using a tool, an AI tool, will be completely different from somebody else using a tool. So as an example, I'm not a lawyer. So if I was to use an AI tool, look, I'm always going to be in this very early, this novice area because I have no idea what I would expect to see when it comes to how the law system exactly works and how should arguments be made and what counts as maybe legally binding or not, etc. There are so many different areas because, of course, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to be able to understand it. And so if I'm to use a tool because I don't have any extra background knowledge about that specific domain, I would be a complete beginner at that, right? Same with if I was to use something that showed me, a specific scan of a medical scan of something that I do not know the anatomy of. Again, you would have very low skill because you wouldn't be able to understand it. On the other hand, say for me, when I'm, let's say, and everyone will have their own expertise, right? Wherever they work in. So let's say when it comes to writing code, it's very easy for me because if I've done a computer science degree, it should be known, it should be expected that, yeah, if I see a piece of code, I can tell roughly if it works or it doesn't work, and if it has an error, where could I fix it? And so it's now the skill level comes into two parts. How familiar you are with the tool itself, and then obviously what domain you are using for this. Because if you're using an AI tool and you're competent with the tool, maybe you could be a little bit higher, maybe beginner, or maybe you could even become competent because you can learn about how the tool works. And if it's something that you're already doing, daily work in, then you could very easily reach this kind of expert level of using that AI tool because you know how AI works and you know what kinds of work you need to do and what answers you want from it, and you'll be able to be really productive. But if somebody doesn't have the skill level within AI, they can only really ever reach beginner because they'll never truly be able to, I'll say it, like unlock the extra power that we can get out of it by using it in a very specific way. A lot of people will ask it certain questions that maybe it's not suitable for it to be asked, and they won't focus on using it for certain things which are really, really useful. So if you need to, take a piece of text you've written and write it more professionally, you can ask it to do that for you, and it'll be really good. You could ask it to summarize a document for you, or to help you create slides for a presentation. And that's where it becomes so important that we then upskill people. We create more resources and more training to help people go from, not really understanding even at all how these tools work and what you're supposed to do with them, to how can we become at least proficient? How can we become more productive in using these tools and understand how they work better so that we can be, more we can become more productive. And so then when you compare yourself to your peers or your coworkers, etc., you're able to do a lot more because you may have the same knowledge, but you have these extra tools at your disposal that you could use. Next one is responsibility, and this is a really, really important one. And what I've done is I've just taken some images from Google's website. And so they mentioned these three principles that they've been following when it comes to responsibility in AI. And so the first one they've mentioned is bold innovation. So this here, these are protein structures. So this is something that's a well-known problem, is that if you take a bunch of these chemicals, I don't know if chemical is the exact right word, but amino acids, it's possible that you can combine them in a specific way to create new protein that could be useful for something very specific. So say helping create a very specific medicine for someone that's suitable for their DNA, as an example. And it's a very big problem because when you take a list of these amino acids, you need to find a way to create this protein structure. And it's very difficult to do it by hand. In fact, I think we've only been able to create, like manually, 120,000. But Google, using this this software, this AI model, this very powerful AI model, AlphaFold 3, they were able to, take any list of amino acids and then give you that protein structure. And in a couple of months, using that tool, we were able to create 200 million. And so now this is such a powerful tool. It won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, I believe, that, this is something that could really help people. If companies start using this tool, they'd be able to solve a lot more issues than we would have been able to before, a lot more personalized medicine, etc. And so when it comes to bold innovation, it's that, well, we have a responsibility that we have these tools and we have the hardware, we have the knowledge on how we can make certain models. So let's use it for an area where it would be really powerful. It would have a lot of real world impact. The second one that they mentioned was talking about development and deployment. So it's the idea that because there are all of these different complexities and risks, you want to be responsible for the whole cycle of going from, making them and then deploying them to when they're being used in the real world, from design to testing. And this is really important in that you don't just create a model and just put it out there and that's it done. Rather, you focus on trying to make sure that you understand how it works and where does it fail, and then reporting that transparently, and of course not taking shortcuts even if they are convenient. Just trying to be responsible in that whole, product life cycle. The last one was a collaborative progress together. And this is really important because there's a lot of tools that are out there that only, let's say, that specific person can use. But if you look at ChatGPT, for example, because it's such a simple app, you just type in a prompt and it gives you a response. There's a huge amount of collective benefit that's obtainable using such a tool. And of course, for the individual themselves, because you as an individual can use it to help you in your own work, in your own daily life. But if we make these AI tools, under extremely high paid subscriptions and or even we don't let other people use them or see them, especially ones that are useful for others, individuals, and also in general for society, Google have basically said that would be irresponsible in that we should be doing things collaboratively together, because as a result, it would give us more progress. The next thing was environmental impact. So here, there are a lot of problems when it comes to how these actual AI models are trained and how they're deployed and how they run. So before we get into any of the information here, when you train a model, you need to use these expensive and very power hungry pieces of hardware, GPUs, graphical processing units, and they just do lots of computation using your data to try and make a model that works. And then once you've deployed your model and people are trying to use it, again you need these different pieces of hardware to actually process those requests. And so everyone recognizes that, well, if you want to build more powerful AI, it makes sense to have more powerful hardware so you can make more powerful models that can deal with a lot more data and that can train for a lot longer. Ways in which that we can, of course, build a better model that has better accuracy. And so here it's like the UK has said that they want to expand their sovereign compute capacity, meaning within the UK, by at least 20 times by 2030. And that's just 5 years. And you see, it mentions about they wants to introduce these AI data centers, beginning with 100 megawatts of capacity, with plans to scale up to 500 megawatts. Like these data centers by themselves would need their own power plants just to let these run. And the UK have also talked about, having specific areas. So these looking at deindustrialized areas and making them AI growth zones, areas in which they can have their data centers and have an increased power supply in order to, power the data centers for, the AI research. And all of this is talking about efficiency, right? Because it's the benefit of what could you get if you were able to have these data centers and do more research and build these more powerful models. What would you be able to achieve? And if we specifically focus on the environmental impact, even if they had recognized, right? This is from the UK government website, that the clean and renewable energy solutions are needed to power the increasing energy demands of AI. The problem is that we will still have politics, right? So ministers insist that notoriously power-hungry server farms will be given priority access to the electricity grid, ahead of people, ahead of the normal people that need power to their own homes. And you have these potential concerns about water shortages. So the reason for this is because these data centers, the pieces of hardware, the GPUs that will be running inside them, and all the other pieces of hardware, they need to be kept cool. And obviously, we don't have to use water. There are different solutions for it, but we can use cold liquids to help, transfer the heat out, the hot heat out, and then cool it down. And the cooler you can keep these pieces of hardware, the faster your models can run, and the more powerful you can effectively make them. And maybe there would be concerns if people start taking shortcuts. If people realize that, no, well, I don't want to pay for all those extra chemicals because they're expensive. I'd rather use water because it's easier to get. Then yes, there would be concerns. And we see that it's not just countries, it's entire, massive companies too, right? Google are looking at using nuclear power plants. Microsoft have bought a 3 Mile Island. So I'm not exactly sure if they bought the 3 Mile Island, but they are planning on having a nuclear power plant on this 3 Mile Island. And it says here 835 megawatt AI data center. Now, for people that don't understand, and like this is more electricity that would be powered here than entire cities and maybe entire countries were. And this is just to process AI models. And Amazon too are also looking at nuclear power. There were certain concerns earlier where people had said, sorry, where Microsoft say had looked at using coal power plants and stuff that wasn't renewable and thought about reopening them, which got a lot of backlash. So now it seems that all of the major companies will try to go for nuclear power. And we just think that obviously all of this is just for the competition in trying to, beat each other to see who can build the best, the most powerful AI and can do the most with it. And this is completely different from what we've seen, let's say, in China. See, there were certain legislation that prevented the export of graphics cards, very powerful ones, to China. And so it meant that certain researchers there, since they have a hardware limitation, they have to focus on the opposite side. So rather than looking at trying to have the most powerful data centers to run the most powerful models, why not focus on trying to make these models more efficient, optimize them, make them more sustainable themselves? Because some of these models will use up so much electricity and so much power just for a single request. And so any kind of improvement to try and optimize these models to make them run faster and make them smaller without giving up too much performance would be a huge benefit. And in the in-person workshop, when I mentioned, when do we stop, I had a lot of response talking about actually, I don't think we should stop. I think it's more about how we continue forward. And I guess it goes back to that big problem of is throwing more compute, more resources at this problem the actual correct solution? Or should we be focused on maybe yes, we can build some more powerful models, but let's take a break and try and optimize them and make them run faster and make them smaller so that they don't use as much power and they don't have as much environmental impact. If we move on to hacking, see, there's been a lot of concerns about the kind of things that AI could be able to do if it was in the hands of malicious people. So OpenAI have a $200 a month subscription to their most to the highest level of service that they provide. And one of the things that they've included there are these AI agents. So you can basically let it access the internet and it can go out and do different things. It can, you can give it a link to a Google Docs or anything like that, and it can start editing and it can start doing things for you. The problem is that yes, maybe they can put things in place that don't let you use it for malicious purposes, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% secure. and that somebody can't use it for wrong. So, just as an example, the amount of, let's say, scam emails that people have fallen for, and that's something that's very simple and it doesn't need, AI to do it because it could be very, very specific. Sorry, very, very general. Like it could just be, oh, your PayPal card details are out of date. Click on this link to update them, right? Anything like that is very general and people have fallen for them. The problem with AI could just be as simple as, well, if I have a database of all of these different people and I've got their email addresses, I can look at the other information associated with that person. So maybe I try to find that person's information on social media, anything that exists out there. And if I can say something personal, something that they wouldn't expect me to have said, or let's say the hacker who's trying to, not necessarily the hacker, but the one who has this malicious intent, then maybe they're more likely to fall for it because it seems more personal, because they understand more about who they are because they've got this extra data. And as an individual to do that every time, it might be too difficult. But an AI would be able to really help speed that up. And, running these attacks, these different ways of, hurting others, it makes it a much more realized threat that it could really happen if people use these tools in the wrong way. And there's not much of a solution for this other than trying to be more careful and understanding that the different techniques that people are using, as a very simple example, changing your passwords constantly and using secure passwords, not doing important information or anything on your device on free Wi-Fi networks, etc. But then you will have stuff like this where it's, well, even companies themselves will have issues, and there's nothing we can do about that. That's just on the company. And this is a really big problem because it doesn't really give you with a solution. The next one was medical diagnosis. So here, basically, I gave it an image of an arm where one of the bones had been fractured. And this was just a ChatGPT, and I just wanted to see what kind of response it could do. Because when we had the first models a couple of years ago, it was really bad at things like this. But now it's gotten a lot better. Like it mentioned, there's a fracture in one of the forearm bones, likely the radius, etc. And yes, it does even tell you, strongly recommend consulting a medical professional for an accurate diagnosis and appropriate treatment. And then again, I give another image, and it was able to tell me exactly where it was, even the specific, it mentioned it was the right leg too. And so now the problem here, the ethical issue is that, well, what if people start utilizing this for, everything about their own, medical, for their, sorry, what if people start using AI tools to inform their medical decisions? So when you get stuff that's as accurate as this, right? So I just put, what is this? And the image actually tells you that the detail on this, it's an ankle showing internal fixation with metal screws, which are here, these white ones. Talks about the procedure, what it likely even was, and why it was done to stabilize that fracture. Like this is really powerful and this is really good. But the problem is what happens when you give it an image that it wasn't able to understand or that it got it wrong. And that's where the ethical issue comes in, is one, you're giving all of this data away. Two, what you will do with the result of this, and how much would you trust your doctor? And number three, what if your doctor starts using these tools and they don't understand or start looking at these things for themselves? So when they get something that's less obvious than this in the previous two images, they just ask the AI, here's a list of the symptoms or here's the image that this person has brought. What's going on? What should I do? And they could just start relying on that AI. And medical diagnosis is a really, really sensitive area because, we're talking about people's lives and deaths. If an AI was to suggest the wrong medication or the wrong procedure, it could have really huge impact. Another one here is IP. So it's you'll find images like this everywhere on the internet where they have like this watermark, which is Getty Images, right? And here you can see it's a little bit worse. But both of these are AI generated images. And what we see is that maybe this one's a little bit better than that one. But you can tell clearly that this was AI generated. And in fact, it was even keeping the watermark, this proprietary copyrighted watermark, from that company, and they released this image. They produced this image, generated it from scratch. And the reason I mention this is because of the issues of IP. So this is what I was talking about earlier, that Meta illegally downloaded 80 plus terabytes of books from these different libraries that you can essentially get access to different books and documents, etc., to train their models. And this man here was somebody who, and I'm not talking about whether what he did was right or wrong. We're just comparing that, look, this was a person who downloaded 70 gigabytes of articles, and he had a $1 million fine and 35 years in jail, and he committed suicide later. And he was one of the founders of Reddit. And was just like, you're just comparing, because the kind of consequences that that man suffered, Aaron Schwartz, will not be anywhere close to what Meta will have to face. For doing something that, when you quantitatively just compare 80 terabytes to 70 gigabytes, you'd expect it to be much worse here, that they would, suffer much worse consequences. But we know that in the world with these huge companies, it's unlikely that that actually happens. And they just get what we would say, a slap on the wrist. And that leads me on to the next one quite nicely, which is talking about politics. When you have the UK who's saying, we have a plan to make our country an AI superpower. And you have these blueprints that they've released talking about turbocharging AI, and it's looking at basically over an entire decade, it's trying to have an idea of what we want to do in each year. And you see that they want to spend billions, and create thousands of jobs. And these are private tech firms, right? These are not government jobs or anything like that. And the reason for that is they say, well, it's based on the IMF's predictions, but 1.5 percentage points a year, approximately 50 billion. We're looking at almost 25% of the NHS's budget. This is a huge amount of money that, yes, could be extremely beneficial for a country if we were able to have the growth as a result of the extra, productivity and the other different things that we can do with AI. So you see here it mentions, right, public sector to spend less time doing admin and more time delivering the services working people rely on. And that's really important. This is one of the most powerful areas of AI in that it can do a lot of the repetitive, boring tasks that are not needed, that take up too much time for people. And it would make their life so much easier, and they can focus more on different areas and, hopefully result in higher growth. And so this was that playbook that they had mentioned, and they had listed a bunch of different principles, and it was all about using it safely, effectively, and securely. And yes, this is specifically for civil servants and people working within government organizations, but it's very general, and a lot of people would be able to benefit from applying any of these different principles. And I think the reason why I thought this was interesting is it's not just about the fact that, what are they exactly saying about AI, but it's more about, if you look at it at the bigger picture, what we're seeing is that the government and these countries have realized that AI is the way forward, and that gives a lot of these private companies a lot of power because they have the most powerful models, and it would be very difficult for governments themselves, entire countries, to be able to compete with them because they just don't have the same level of resources. And you'll see different approaches from different countries, right? So this was the EU AI Act that I mentioned earlier, and it was the first regulation on AI. And I mean, it makes sense. So they talk about these different categories of AI systems. The ones which are common systems, so like spam filters, recommender systems, which don't have any specific regulation because they're minimal risk. And then you can see, well, as you start getting up higher and higher, the risk starts to increase. So something that's going to, like a chatbot, so like a chat GPT, there's a transparency risk. So it should explain how did it come up with its different, outputs, and then talking more about, that it was generated by AI, and that design it so it doesn't generate illegal content, and talk about the summary of the copyrighted data that was used for training. And this is so interesting because they've mentioned and they've recognized that, yes, they will be training using copyrighted data, and that's what this looks like, is that it's completely fine. That they're not saying it's a huge issue, but what they want is give the summary of that data that was used for training. And of course, we can look at the US as well. right? So this was an image from Trump's inauguration, and these are all some of the extremely wealthy billionaire CEOs and the leaders of the different companies. And a day later, Trump says that he's going to take money from the United Arab Emirates and Japan to put $500 billion into this project called Stargate to build up AI in the US. And this was the vice president who, at the AI Action Summit in Paris, this was just over a month ago now, he said that he's not going to talk about AI safety. He wants to talk about AI opportunity. And we know this, that the culture differences are very different in let's say America than they are in other countries, in that people here, they focus on innovation and trying to make really cool tools. If we just look at the difference between the AI tools that we have in healthcare that the NHS have deployed and what we have in America, it's completely different. In America, it's everywhere, and they do it without your consent, and they just make these tools and they're out there and they are working. And people are becoming very rich on making these tools. But in the UK, it's so much more difficult to get the funding, to get it approved, to get it deployed, to get access to the data. Rather talking about responsible AI than AI safety. And then you get stuff like this too. That they're coining this an AI race, and this is where you get into a problem where it's like, well, why does it have to be that like we're looking at this as a negative way? You know, AI is a very big, it's very powerful in what it can provide us and what it can do for us. But then should it be that we look at it as countries are against each other in terms of one country does good, the other country, must be doing bad? When China, the hedge fund released DeepSeek, $1 trillion were lost on the stock market from the different tech companies and others, which is a huge amount of money. And the question, I mean, maybe that's also to do with the fact that, they were able to create a model that was much cheaper with much less resources. But when we talk about this as an AI race and we're talking about the countries involved itself, it's like, what does that show? So the last two main slides, we're talking about surveillance and disinformation. So we won't go into this for 5 minutes, but the main problems that you have with these AI surveillance tools is that because they can just store so much data, right, from the cameras and the videos, and they can combine it with, let's say, your phone calls and social media data, your location data, in your Google Maps and where you're going, etc., is that if there are certain companies that provide all of these different services to you, right? So let's say Google, they know what you're watching on YouTube, they know what you're typing in Google search, right? They know all the websites you visit because of Google Chrome. And because you're using Google Maps, they know where you're traveling. You combine all of these things together, and there's a lot of issues that could potentially come around with it if it's not used in the right way. And so the last one, I guess, is misinformation. This is specifically looking at Americans about do they have a favorable or unfavorable opinion on AI. And yes, a decent amount said that they don't know, they're not familiar, or they skipped it, but more people are unfavorable than favorable. And it's really interesting because when you look at the percentage of what, of the people in terms of what they think AI is, like this is pretty accurate, right? Going to be another piece of technology among many. The interesting thing is the 6%, which says that it's not going to have much of a real impact because it will, and it already has been making an impact on society. And maybe it would fundamentally change, American society. But the important thing is that it is a technology, it's a piece of technology, it's a tool that can be used. The fear would be when you start looking at things that are unfavorable is then when it's used for specific things or by specific people to do tasks that we don't want it to do. Right, so we don't want AI to, let's say, do certain things that are more sensitive or things that previously were done by people that and it's a very common job that we would have lost lots of it because then you would be unfavorable. So call centers no longer need to have as many people manning the phones, answering the phones because AI can do a lot of that work for them, and you can just make a chatbot that you can answer, and you can have much less people in person. And so, of course, anybody who has such a job will be unfavorable because this kind of tool will be directly taking their jobs. But the reason I talk about misinformation, I wanted to point out misinformation here, is that The fact that there are still people that skipped or that said that they weren't going to have much of an impact, it's clear that there are still going to be people that, because they, let's say, have not studied it or they see it as the news and they don't know about the technicalities and the other kinds of things that will impact, having an AI model when it comes to the deploying it in real world use and of course how you test it and developed it in the first place. He said the more that somebody understands that, then we can at least say they're not misinformed. They can have a completely valid opinion, and that's fine, but at least they're not going to be informed by other than the truth, and then they can make their own decisions for themselves based on, what are the actual facts? What is it that actually happens? As a preliminary, I left a couple questions just to think about, but I think the main thing here is that, there are lots of ethical issues with AI, and it's going to be on the people that use them to use them responsibly, and then to think about all of these other different ethical issues in that you can try and mitigate those problems, right? So if we know that, if data falls into the wrong hands, it could be a bad thing. Do we want our models to use that much data? Do we want to try and use it with less data so that, in worst case situations and scenarios, the impact wouldn't be too much? And thinking about things in a more holistic way. That's the end. Thank you all for coming. Next week, the plan was to have like a mini hackathon, but I think it'll be easier if what I will do is instead show you the task that we had planned, and then I'll go through and do an example myself. So I'll show you how you can just go straight from finding a random data set online and building some AI with it. And of course, you'll be free to go off and work on your own projects. Thank you all for coming. I'm in the meeting now.